Duke Edmund sold the building that housed his wife's hospital during a banquet and announced the bargain before 300 guests. He waited until every champagne glass had been filled before rising beneath the gilded portrait of his grandfather. Lord Ashford sat at his right hand, while Ashford's widowed sister, Lady Lavinia, occupied the chair beside him. A leather document case rested beneath her gloved fingers. "Tonight marks the beginning of a more prosperous age for Ravenscourt," Edmund declared. "At noon tomorrow, Lord Ashford will assume control of the Bell Street property. The hospital has consumed estate resources for too long without producing a reasonable return." A murmur passed through the ballroom. At the opposite end of the table, Duchess Margaret set down her spoon. For 12 years, she had transformed Bell Street from an abandoned lodging house into a respected charitable hospital. Her dowry trust had paid for its beds, instruments, medicines, and nurses. Her father's connections at the Royal College of Physicians had brought qualified doctors to its fever ward. Donations from merchants and landowners kept its doors open to laborers who could never afford private care. Edmund had contributed the building through a lease from the Ravenscourt estate. That was all he legally controlled. Margaret looked across the candles at her husband. "You have terminated the trust's lease without consulting its trustees?" Edmund's expression tightened. He disliked being questioned in private. Before an audience, he treated disagreement as rebellion. "The building belongs to Ravenscourt," he replied. "I require no committee's permission to decide how it will be used. And what has Lord Ashford promised in return?" Several guests stopped pretending not to listen. Ashford lifted his glass. "Only the support His Grace deserves. Men of influence recognize that Ravenscourt ought to have a stronger voice in Parliament." There it was. Edmund had displaced a hospital to purchase votes. Lady Lavinia opened the leather case and withdrew a copy of the agreement. "The estate will receive an annual rent, together with a share of Bell Street's future income. Under professional management, the institution may finally become self-supporting." "By refusing treatment to those who cannot pay?" Margaret asked. "By ending waste," Lavinia answered smoothly. "Charity without discipline encourages dependence." Margaret saw Mrs. Hale, the hospital's chief nurse, standing near the servants' entrance. Their eyes met for barely a second. Margaret touched 2 fingers to the stem of her glass. It was a signal they had established years ago in case fire, seizure, or scandal threatened the hospital records. Mrs. Hale quietly disappeared. Edmund continued describing Ashford's plan. The hospital would reopen as a paying infirmary. Half the nurses would be dismissed. Free beds would be limited to patients approved by the estate office, and the dispensary would sell its medicines rather than distribute them through the villages. Margaret felt something inside her grow cold. "You knew these terms," she said. "I approved them." "You knew the fever ward would close? For the winter, Ashford considers it an unnecessary expense. Last winter, that ward treated 86 tenants from your estate, and Bell Street nearly exhausted its reserve funds doing so." "The reserves came from my trust," Edmund's voice hardened. "You have mistaken management of a charity for ownership of Ravenscourt property." "No," Margaret said. "You have mistaken ownership of 4 walls for ownership of everything inside them." Silence spread outward from the table. She rose. "The beds belong to the Bell Street Trust. The instruments were purchased by my father's foundation. The medicine cabinets, linens, kitchen equipment, patient registers, and charitable funds are governed by agreements bearing the signatures of 5 trustees. Neither you nor Lord Ashford may sell them." Ashford's smile disappeared. Lady Lavinia remained composed, but her gaze moved at once to the document case. That small reaction told Margaret the distinction was not a surprise to her. Lavinia had known what Edmund could legally transfer, and had allowed him to announce something far greater. Edmund pushed back his chair. "Sit down, Margaret. You chose to make this public. I will not be contradicted in my own house. And I will not permit you to give away property entrusted to the sick merely because Lord Ashford promised you a seat in Parliament." A few guests lowered their eyes. Others watched Edmund openly now. Margaret removed the brass key to Bell Street from her reticule and placed it beside her untouched glass. "At noon tomorrow, Lord Ashford may take possession of an empty building. Before then, the trust will remove everything it owns and transfer every patient who can safely be moved." "You would dismantle the hospital out of spite?" Edmund demanded. "I am protecting it from the men who intend to dismantle it for profit." She turned and walked the length of the banquet table. No one attempted to stop her. Lady Lavinia's voice followed her. "Be careful, Your Grace. Removing medicines during an outbreak could be interpreted as endangering the public." Margaret paused at the door. "There is no outbreak." "Not yet," Lavinia replied. By midnight, the Bell Street courtyard blazed with lanterns. Mrs. Hale had already secured the patient registers, donation accounts, trust deeds, and dispensary books. Nurses packed medicines into numbered chests while porters dismantled bedsteads marked with the trust seal. Stable patients were transferred to an unused coaching inn provided by Sir William Harbury, one of Margaret's fellow trustees. Those too ill to travel would remain at Bell Street, under the care of Dr. Samuel Bell, until the lease expired at noon. "You expected the Duke might try this," Mrs. Hale said. "I expected Edmund to interfere with the trustees," Margaret replied. "I did not expect him to sacrifice the hospital so openly." A bottle slipped from an open crate and rolled across the stones. Margaret picked it up. Blue wax covered the stopper, bearing what appeared to be her personal seal. The label identified the contents as willow bark tincture prepared that morning, but her seal contained 3 fine lines beneath the letter M. This impression had only 2. "Who packed this crate?" she asked. Mrs. Hale examined the dispensary ledger. "No one from our staff. It was delivered this afternoon under Dr. Pritchard's authority." He ordered the older supply removed. "Ashford's physician entered our dispensary before Edmund announced the transfer?" "Yes." Margaret held the bottle toward a lantern. A dark sediment clung to the glass. When she loosened the stopper, an unfamiliar metallic odor rose from the tincture. She did not attempt to identify it herself. "Seal this bottle in the evidence chest," she ordered. "Send it, the ledger, and an unopened duplicate to Dr. Bell. Then dispatch a rider to my father. No one is to administer anything delivered by Pritchard." Mrs. Hale's face tightened. 24 bottles arrived. "Where are the others?" Before she could answer, carriage wheels thundered beyond the gates. A Ravenscourt carriage lurched into the courtyard and struck the curb. Edmund jumped down before the driver could open the door. His evening coat hung unfastened, and the triumph had vanished from his face. In his arms lay their 12-year-old son. Henry's skin was gray, sweat dampened his hair, and every breath seemed to catch painfully inside his chest. "He collapsed at school," Edmund said. "Pritchard claims it is scarlet fever." Margaret moved toward her child, but Dr. Pritchard descended from the carriage and blocked her path. In one hand, he carried an official order authorizing the seizure of Bell Street's medicines. In the other, he held a bottle sealed with pale blue wax. "Do not allow the Duchess near the patient," he said. "The medicine administered to Lord Henry came from her dispensary." Edmund looked from the bottle to Margaret. "If your hospital caused this, my hospital did not send that medicine. You cannot possibly know." Margaret stepped closer and held up the counterfeit bottle she had just found. "I know, because these seals are identical, and neither of them is mine." For the first time, Pritchard's composure faltered. Margaret reached for Henry. Edmund hesitated, his son trembling between them. Then Henry opened his eyes. "The blue medicine," he whispered. "Dr. Pritchard said father ordered me to drink it." Edmund went still. "I gave no such order." Margaret looked at the false seal, the physician's seizure notice, and the child her husband had placed in Ashford's care. The sale had not begun with Edmund's announcement at dinner. It had begun inside her dispensary hours earlier, and someone had already used Henry to make certain Margaret would be blamed. Margaret did not wait for Edmund to decide whom he believed. "Dr. Bell," she called. The physician emerged from the hospital as 2 porters moved between Margaret and Pritchard. Edmund still held Henry, frozen by the accusation his son had just made. "Give him to Dr. Bell," Margaret ordered. Pritchard stepped forward. "I am Lord Henry's physician." "You administered a medicine bearing a false seal," Margaret replied. "You will not touch him again." Edmund looked down at Henry's gray face. For one terrible moment, Margaret feared his pride would outweigh their son's safety. Then Henry shuddered violently. Edmund surrendered him. Dr. Bell carried the boy inside and ordered a nurse to bring warm water, clean linen, and a basin. Margaret followed as far as the examination room door. "Let me work," he told her quietly. "Preserve every bottle, label, and written order. We will need more than suspicion before morning." Margaret forced herself to step back. Pritchard remained in the courtyard, holding the order authorizing the seizure of Bell Street's medicines. Margaret took the paper from him and examined it beneath a lantern. The document bore Magistrate Vale's official seal, but its language was strangely broad. It authorized Ashford's agents to remove every medicine in the hospital before any independent examination had taken place. "Who requested this order?" she asked. "The estate office," Pritchard replied. "Before or after Henry became ill?" Pritchard's silence answered her. Margaret turned to Mrs. Hale. "Lock the dispensary, no bottle leaves without being recorded and witnessed by 2 trustees." "You cannot obstruct a magistrate's order," Pritchard said. I am preserving the evidence named in it. Edmund finally found his voice. If Margaret's medicines are responsible, they must be surrendered. She faced him. Those bottles entered Bell Street under the authority you gave Ashford. If you remove them now, you may be handing the evidence back to the men who placed them here. Edmund's face tightened, but he could not deny the connection. Mrs. Hale returned with the delivery ledger. 24 counterfeit bottles had arrived that afternoon. 6 remained in the crate. 1 had been sent with Henry. The other 17 were listed as transferred to village infirmaries across Ravenscourt. Margaret read the destinations: Eastmere, Holcombe, Renford, Alderton. All 4 villages depended upon Bell Street for charitable medicine. Who approved the transfers? She asked. Mrs. Hale pointed to a signature at the bottom of the page. It appeared to be Margaret's, yet the signature used the formal flourish she had abandoned after her marriage 13 years earlier. That was copied from an old letter, Margaret said. Pritchard moved toward the gate. One of the porters blocked him. Edmund seized the physician's arm. Where were those bottles sent? I merely prescribed the tonic. The dispensary arranged its distribution. The dispensary has no record of preparing it, Margaret said. And you entered the hospital hours before the transfer was announced. Pritchard tore free. I will not remain here while a frightened woman invents accusations to protect her reputation. He ran through the open gate. A saddled horse waited beyond the wall, as though his escape had been prepared in advance. Edmund ordered 2 estate men to pursue him, but Pritchard disappeared into the darkness before they reached the road. Margaret did not waste time watching them fail. She dispatched riders to the 4 villages with orders to seize every blue-sealed bottle and warn the inhabitants not to drink the tonic. Mrs. Hale sent another messenger to Magistrate Vale to confirm whether the seizure order was genuine. Only then did Dr. Bell return. Henry is conscious, he said. He has no scarlet rash, and his symptoms do not resemble an ordinary fever. I cannot yet name the substance, but the tonic may be responsible. Will he live? Edmund asked. I believe we stopped the doses in time, but he must be watched closely. Margaret entered the room. Henry lay beneath clean blankets, his breathing still shallow. She sat beside him and took his hand. How many times did Dr. Pritchard give you the blue medicine? 3, Henry whispered. Once each evening. Did he bring it himself? Henry nodded. He said father wanted me strong for the banquet. Margaret looked toward Edmund. I never told him that, he said. No, you only gave Ashford control of the building and allowed his physician access to our son. The words struck him harder than any public insult could have done. He lowered his eyes, but Margaret felt no pity. Henry was lying between them because Edmund had trusted the men offering him political power more than the woman who had managed Bell Street for 12 years. Hooves sounded in the courtyard shortly before dawn. The first rider had returned from Eastmere. Blood ran from a cut above his brow, and his coat was torn at the shoulder. He nearly fell as Margaret and Mrs. Hale helped him inside. Ashford's men tried to stop me on the road, he said, but I reached the village. Did anyone take the medicine? 14 people. They began vomiting before midnight. The chapel has been turned into a sick room. Dr. Bell immediately summoned 2 assistants and prepared to leave for Eastmere. Margaret secured the counterfeit bottles, the forged delivery record, and Pritchard's written order in a locked evidence chest. Edmund reached for his coat. I am coming. No, Margaret said. This is my estate. That is precisely what Ashford expected you to say. Stay with Henry, and send men to protect the remaining villages. For once, use your authority where it may help instead of where it will interfere. Margaret traveled with Dr. Bell and Mrs. Hale. They reached Eastmere after sunrise. 14 villagers lay on blankets inside the chapel, while 2 local nurses moved among them. Dr. Bell took charge of their treatment, as Margaret questioned the woman who had received the delivery. The men said the tonic came from you, the nurse explained. They ordered 1 dose for every family named on this list. Margaret examined the list. Each household had borrowed money from the Ravenscourt Relief Fund after the previous winter's crop failure. Beside the altar stood the open medicine crate. 11 bottles remained inside. Beneath them, Margaret found copies of the family's debt agreements and a packet of sealed documents. She opened the first. It was a death certificate for Thomas Reed, who lay alive 10 feet away under Dr. Bell's care. The stated cause was fever. The date of death was 3 days in the future. Margaret opened the next certificate, then the next. Everyone named a living debtor from Eastmere. At the bottom of the packet lay a map, marked with their cottages and fields. Someone had not merely expected the villagers to die. Someone had already decided who would take possession of their land afterward. Margaret studied the map while Dr. Bell tended the villagers. The marked properties did not lie close together. Some stood miles apart, separated by woodland, pasture, and Ravenscourt tenant farms. Yet a single red line connected every one of them. Mrs. Hale leaned over her shoulder. "What does it mean?" "I do not know yet." Margaret examined the debt agreements beneath the death certificates. The families were not ordinary tenants. Each owned a small freehold bordering the Ravenscourt estate. After the previous winter's failed harvest, they had borrowed money from the estate relief fund and pledged those holdings as security. Edmund had recently transferred collection of those debts to Lord Ashford. If the borrowers died without heirs able to repay, Ashford could demand the sale of their land. A carriage stopped outside the chapel. Edmund entered alone. Exhaustion marked his face, but Henry's condition had evidently improved enough for him to leave the hospital. "How is he?" Margaret asked. "Awake. Your father is with him." Only then did she hand Edmund one of the death certificates. "This man is still alive," she said. "The document declares that he will die 3 days from now. His land is pledged against a debt Ashford now controls." Edmund read it twice. "I never authorized this." "You authorized Ashford to collect the loans, to reorganize the relief fund. Did you know he intended to demand immediate payment?" Edmund hesitated. That was answer enough. He said discipline was necessary, he admitted. Some borrowers had missed payments for nearly a year, because they used their harvest money to feed their families. "The estate cannot support every household indefinitely." Margaret kept her voice low. "You knew Bell Street would dismiss nurses. You knew poor patients would lose treatment. You knew Ashford would pursue these debts. How much suffering did you consider acceptable for his political support?" "I did not know anyone would be poisoned." "No, but you gave him authority over the people he intended to harm." Edmund looked toward the villagers lying beneath the chapel windows. He could no longer dismiss them as figures in an account book. One was a young mother. Another was the former groom who had taught Henry to ride. "I will revoke Ashford's authority," he said. "Can you?" His expression changed. Margaret understood before he answered. "The agreement remains effective until the parliamentary vote," Edmund said. "Ending it early would make me responsible for Ashford's expenses." "You mean his campaign money?" "Yes, and how much did he advance?" Edmund looked away. "More than I can repay immediately." Margaret felt no surprise now, only a deepening certainty that Ashford had not needed to deceive her husband about everything. He had merely offered Edmund enough prestige to make cruelty appear practical. Sir Thomas arrived from Bell Street shortly before noon. He brought reassuring news about Henry and a sealed letter taken from Ashford's former surveyor. "The man resigned 2 months ago," Sir Thomas explained. "He believed Ashford was using confidential railway plans to purchase land through intermediaries." Margaret unfolded the enclosed survey. A proposed branch line ran across the district toward the northern coal depots. It followed the same red path marked on the map from the medicine crate. Every poisoned household stood directly upon it. "Ashford does not want the relief payments," she said. "He wants the land before the railway proposal becomes public." Edmund stared at the survey. The value would increase tenfold, and the owners would never know why their homes were taken. The false outbreak would isolate the villages. The prepared death certificates would explain the disappearance of selected borrowers. Ashford could then acquire their mortgaged holdings before competing buyers learned of the railway. Margaret turned to Mrs. Hale. "Send copies of both maps to every trustee. Record the names of all surviving patients, and have 2 witnesses sign each statement. No original document is to leave our custody." Edmund stepped closer. "Give me the evidence. I will have Ashford arrested." "On whose authority?" "As Duke of Ravenscourt. You have no power to imprison a peer because you finally regret doing business with him. We will take the evidence to Magistrate Vale and proceed lawfully. He may escape while you wait. He expects you to accuse him without a complete case. Then he will blame Pritchard, call the certificates crude forgeries, and claim you are attacking him to avoid repaying your debt." Edmund had no answer. A rider entered the chapel carrying a packet addressed to Margaret. The seal belonged to Lady Lavinia. Inside were copies of similar death certificates from Holcombe, Renford, and Alderton. Attached to them was a formal notice declaring that, because Bell Street's medicines were suspected of causing an outbreak, Margaret's charitable accounts would be frozen pending investigation. A brief handwritten message appeared beneath the order. "By noon tomorrow, the hospital trust will possess neither a building nor the funds to move elsewhere." Margaret folded the notice. Lavinia expected her to spend the next day defending her reputation. Instead, Margaret looked at the names of the threatened landowners. "Summon every family on these lists," she told Mrs. Hale. If Ashford intends to take their land one household at a time, we will make certain he must face them all together. Margaret read Lavinia's notice a second time. It was not a court order. Ashford had petitioned the authorities to suspend Bell Street's operations, but no judge had yet ruled. However, copies had already been sent to the trust's bankers and major donors. Until the accusation was resolved, they might refuse further payments simply to avoid scandal. Lavinia did not need to win in court that day. She only needed everyone to believe Margaret had poisoned her own patients. By afternoon, newspapers from London were repeating the allegation. One described Bell Street as a Duchess's dangerous experiment. Another claimed Margaret had ordered untested medicine distributed throughout Ravenscourt. The articles were printed before the patients became ill, Sir Thomas observed. Margaret examined the publication date. Then Lavinia prepared the scandal in advance. Edmund crushed one of the newspapers in his hand. I will issue a denial. They will call it a husband protecting his wife. I am the Duke. My word still carries weight. It carried enough weight to place Ashford inside my hospital. Edmund fell silent. Margaret refused to answer the accusations with another private statement. She sent notices to Bell Street's trustees, its donors, the Royal College of Physicians, and every village named in the delivery ledger. All medicines bearing her seal would be secured. Independent physicians would examine the patients, while 2 chemists chosen by the trustees, not by Ravenscourt, would test the authentic tincture against Pritchard's bottles. The results would be recorded before witnesses and made available to the press. If we conceal nothing, Ashford cannot control which facts survive, she said. That evening, Magistrate Vale arrived at Eastmere. He inspected the earlier seizure order and immediately shook his head. The seal is mine, but I did not authorize this language. My clerk presented a narrower order allowing the bottles to be preserved, not removed. Who altered it? Margaret asked. I cannot yet prove that. The official copy disappeared from my office this morning. Vale placed Bell Street's remaining medicine under neutral custody and authorized the trust to continue treating existing patients. He could not restore access to the building after Edmund's lease transfer, but he prevented Ashford from seizing the evidence. The first independent examination began the following morning. Dr. Bell presented an authentic bottle from Bell Street's reserve stock. A chemist compared its color, sediment, and preparation record with Pritchard's tonic. The counterfeit bottle contained a metallic substance absent from Margaret's formula, though further testing would be required to identify it conclusively. That preliminary difference was enough to challenge the newspaper's claim that both medicines were identical. Mrs. Hale then brought Margaret the dispensary copying ledger. One book is missing, she said. The volume containing your early formulas. Who last signed for it? Mrs. Hale pointed to an entry dated the morning before the banquet. The name belonged to a junior clerk recently appointed at Dr. Pritchard's request. He had not reported for work since. Ashford's people had entered Bell Street before Edmund transferred the building. They had copied Margaret's old signature, taken her formulas, replaced the medicines, and prepared the accusation in advance. A black carriage arrived outside the chapel. Lady Lavinia entered without invitation. She wore no expression of alarm at the sight of Magistrate Vale or the independent physicians. You have made an impressive spectacle, she told Margaret. But spectacles require money. How long can your temporary infirmary survive after your donors withdraw? As long as the truth requires. Lavinia placed a proposed settlement on the table. If Margaret surrendered her formulas, withdrew her objection to the Bell Street transfer, and publicly accepted responsibility for errors in supervision, Ashford would release enough funds to maintain 20 charitable beds. Edmund stepped forward. You are asking my wife to confess to a crime your physician committed. Lavinia barely looked at him. My brother purchased your cooperation already, Your Grace. This conversation concerns what remains valuable. Margaret closed the settlement without signing it. You stole one formula book, she said. If that gave you everything you needed, you would not be here asking for the rest. For the first time, uncertainty touched Lavinia's face. It vanished quickly, but Margaret had seen it. The stolen book was incomplete, and whatever Ashford intended to manufacture under Margaret's name, he could not finish it without the records still in her possession. Lady Lavinia left the chapel without the formula books. That evening, Lord Ashford sent Edmund a private message requesting a meeting at Ravenscourt. Margaret expected her husband to go alone. Instead, he brought her the sealed letter. Ashford offers to withdraw his claim against the estate, Edmund said. He will also persuade the newspapers to blame Pritchard. In exchange for what? Edmund placed the letter before her. Ashford required him to declare publicly that Margaret had operated Bell Street without estate supervision, distributed the medicines through her own negligence, and invented the land conspiracy to conceal her failures. If Edmund complied, Ashford promised to preserve his parliamentary support and delay collection of the money advanced for his campaign. If you refuse, Margaret asked, he will demand immediate repayment and release my correspondence to the press. Margaret looked at him across the table. Then you must decide which reputation you intend to save. Edmund was silent for a long moment. A week ago, I would have believed there was still some compromise to be made, he admitted. A week ago, Henry had not been poisoned. No, but the villagers would still have lost their treatment. I simply found that consequence easier to ignore. It was the first honest thing he had said since the banquet. Edmund took a packet of letters from inside his coat. These are all my communications with Ashford. I will give them to Magistrate Vale. Margaret did not thank him. Surrendering evidence was not generosity when his own decisions had helped create the danger. She opened the earliest letter. Ashford had described Bell Street's free ward as an unproductive burden. He proposed dismissing half the nurses, closing the fever ward during winter, and refusing treatment to anyone unable to pay a deposit. Edmund had answered in his own hand, proceed as necessary, provided the hospital's income supports the parliamentary campaign before the autumn vote. Margaret read the sentence again. You told me Ashford had explained only administrative reforms. He did. This is not an administrative reform. You knew exactly who would be turned away. I knew the hospital would change. You knew children with fever would be refused at the door. I did not know he intended to poison anyone. Margaret raised her eyes to him. That may protect you from a criminal charge. It does not make what you agreed to innocent. Edmund's face tightened, but he did not attempt to take back the letters. Further correspondence showed that Ashford had asked for authority over the relief debts. Edmund had approved it despite a warning from his estate steward that several borrowers might lose their small holdings. He had not known about the railway survey or the false death certificates, but he had understood that Ashford intended to profit from vulnerable families and had accepted the risk because Ashford promised him political influence. Mrs. Hale entered, carrying news from Bell Street's bankers. After reviewing Ashford's petition, they had declined to freeze the trust's accounts. However, 2 major donors had suspended their contributions until the investigation ended. The temporary infirmary could operate for several weeks, not months. Ashford expects the hospital to collapse before we prove the medicine was altered, Margaret said. Then use Ravenscourt funds, Edmund replied. You pledged those funds to Ashford. I will sell property. Property cannot be sold before morning, and I will not rebuild Bell Street on another promise you may later withdraw. Margaret gathered Edmund's letters and placed them with the forged delivery record, death certificates, and railway maps. The hospital needs independence, not another temporary rescue from its landlord. Edmund looked at the evidence of every decision that had brought them there. What do you intend to do? Prevent Ashford from profiting. The following morning, Margaret summoned the threatened landowners to Eastmere. More than 40 families arrived carrying copies of their loan agreements. Sir Thomas brought solicitors retained by the Women's Trust, while Magistrate Vale arranged for each borrower's statement to be witnessed. Margaret explained the plan. No family would negotiate alone. They would challenge the altered debts together, notify the proposed railway company that ownership of the entire route was disputed, and make the prepared death certificates public if Ashford attempted a single seizure. By noon, every landowner had signed. Hours later, the railway company suspended all negotiations connected to Ashford's proposed corridor. The land he had expected to acquire cheaply was now legally contested and publicly linked to poisoned medicine. Ashford's investment began collapsing, but so did Edmund's bargain. A formal demand arrived at Ravenscourt before sunset. Ashford's financial backers required repayment of the campaign advance within 14 days. The amount was greater than Edmund's available income for the entire year. Margaret handed him the notice. You exchanged my hospital for political power, she said. Now you may discover what that power actually cost. The repayment demand did not give Ashford control of Ravenscourt overnight. It gave him something more useful: pressure. His financial backers placed claims against Edmund's London residence, horses, hunting lodge, and other property that was not protected by the ducal settlement. If Edmund failed to pay within 14 days, those assets could be sold through the courts. Ravenscourt itself would survive. Edmund's political future would not. By the following morning, newspapers had learned that the Duke had pledged personal property to finance his campaign. Several parliamentary supporters withdrew rather than become associated with poisoned medicine and disputed land. Margaret found Edmund in the Eastmere Chapel, reading the notices in silence. "I can still challenge the demand," he said. "You may challenge any fraudulent charge, but the campaign advance was real." "Yes." "And you accepted it?" "Yes." For once, he offered no excuse. Outside, the threatened landowners had assembled to hear what would happen to their homes. Some had served Ravenscourt for decades. Others had voted for estate candidates, trusted estate stewards, and borrowed from a relief fund they believed existed to protect them. Margaret would not speak in Edmund's place. He went alone to the chapel steps. "I transferred collection of your debts to Lord Ashford," he told the crowd. "My steward warned me that families could lose their land. I approved the agreement because Ashford promised to advance my political career." Angry voices rose immediately. Edmund did not retreat. "I did not know of the poisoned medicine or the false death certificates, but I gave Ashford the authority that allowed him to reach you. That decision was mine." No one applauded when he finished. Margaret considered that appropriate. A confession did not erase the danger. It merely ended the lie that Edmund had been an innocent victim of Ashford's deception. Later, Edmund offered to sell part of his personal collection to support the temporary infirmary. Margaret refused to place the hospital under another private promise. Instead, the trustees created an emergency fund, controlled by 3 independent signatories. Sir Thomas secured additional rooms in the coaching inn. Dr. Bell submitted his preliminary findings to the Royal College, while several donors restored their contributions after seeing the counterfeit seal and altered delivery records. Bell Street no longer had its building, but for the first time, its work no longer depended upon Edmund's permission. That afternoon, Magistrate Vale brought new evidence. His officers had located the junior clerk who removed Margaret's formula book. The young man had attempted to leave the district using money supplied by Lady Lavinia. "He admits taking the volume," Vale said, "but he claims he delivered it to Ashford's warehouse unopened." "Where is the warehouse?" Margaret asked. "He does not know. Lavinia's men changed carriages twice." The clerk had preserved one useful detail. Before stealing the book, he had copied a list of its contents for Pritchard. Margaret examined the list. The missing volume contained only early formulas, mixtures she had abandoned after discovering they became unstable when prepared in large quantities. Her final corrections were recorded in a separate book now secured by the trustees. "That is why Lavinia offered 20 beds in exchange for the remaining records," Mrs. Hale said. "She cannot safely manufacture the medicine without them." "She may not care whether it is safe," Margaret replied. "If Lavinia produced those abandoned formulas under Margaret's name, more patients could be harmed. If the medicine failed, Margaret would be blamed again." Margaret ordered every surviving formula book moved from the temporary infirmary to Magistrate Vale's evidence room. 2 certified copies were sent separately to the Royal College. By sunset, the originals were secure, or so Margaret believed. Near midnight, a stable boy arrived at Sir Thomas's house, coughing and streaked with soot. "The coaching inn," he gasped. Men broke into the dispensary. When the nurses stopped them, they chained the rear door. Margaret was already reaching for her cloak. "Where are the patients?" The boy's eyes filled with terror. "Still inside. The roof is burning." Margaret reached the coaching inn before the estate fire wagon. Flames had consumed the dispensary windows and were spreading beneath the roof. Smoke poured from the upper floor, where weakened patients had been sleeping. The front entrance stood open, but the corridor beyond it was already impassable. "How many remain inside?" Margaret demanded. 11 patients and 2 nurses, Mrs. Hale replied. The men who broke in chained the kitchen door before they set the fire. Margaret knew the old inn from the weeks spent converting it into a temporary infirmary. A narrow service passage connected the kitchen cellar to the stable yard. It had once been used to carry beer barrels into the building. "The cellar passage," she said. "Break through the stable wall." Villagers attacked the old bricks with hammers and iron bars. Others formed a line from the horse trough, passing buckets toward the burning roof. Margaret divided the available men between opening the passage and keeping the fire away from the patients' rooms. Edmund arrived with the Ravenscourt fire wagon. He began issuing orders, but Margaret stopped him. "The roof above the eastern corridor may collapse. Send your men to the stable yard and follow Mrs. Hale's instructions." Edmund looked as if he might object. Then a section of burning timber fell across the front steps. He obeyed. Once the passage was opened, 2 porters crawled into the cellar beneath wet blankets. Mrs. Hale directed them through the smoke, while Margaret organized the patients outside by severity. Dr. Bell and his assistants treated burns and smoke inhalation as each person emerged. The first nurse came out supporting a child between her arms. Then 4 patients were carried through on doors removed from the stable. A 5th could walk with help. Edmund entered with the next rescue group and returned carrying an unconscious elderly man. Sparks had burned through one sleeve of his coat, but he refused treatment until the remaining patients were accounted for. Margaret felt relief that he had chosen correctly. She did not confuse relief with forgiveness. 12 people had escaped when Mrs. Hale counted again. "1 nurse is missing," she said. Miss Carter went back for the dispensary ledger. "The original records are no longer inside," Margaret said. She did not know that. Before anyone could stop her, Margaret moved toward the service passage. Edmund caught her arm. "The ceiling is failing, and Miss Carter is still beneath it." He released her only when 2 firemen agreed to enter. Minutes later, they emerged carrying the nurse between them. Miss Carter was alive but badly burned along one hand. Dr. Bell ordered her taken immediately to Sir Thomas's house. The roof collapsed moments afterward. By dawn, the coaching inn had become a shell of blackened stone. No patient had died, but 3 remained in serious condition, and the temporary hospital Margaret had built in a single night was gone. Edmund stood beside her with his injured arm bandaged. "I am sorry," he said. "For the fire? For all of it." Margaret watched nurses wrap salvaged blankets around the displaced patients. "You helped tonight because people were in danger. That was the decent thing to do. It does not erase the choices that placed them here. I know." It was the first time he accepted the judgment without asking her to soften it. When Miss Carter regained consciousness, she described 2 men entering the dispensary shortly before the flames began. "They demanded the formula books," she whispered. "I told them the books had been removed. One said Lady Lavinia would not believe us." "Did you recognize either man?" Magistrate Vale asked. "No, but one dropped this." From beneath her scorched apron, Miss Carter produced a brass warehouse token. A number had been stamped beneath the image of a river crane. Sir Thomas recognized the mark. "It belongs to a private quay on the Thames," he said. "Ashford leased storage rooms there last month through another company." The attackers had failed to recover Margaret's formulas, but the token gave Magistrate Vale sufficient grounds to investigate the warehouse's connection to the arson. Margaret looked at the ashes of the infirmary. "If we search it openly, Lavinia will empty the building before we arrive." "What do you propose?" Vale asked. "We let her believe one formula survived the fire." Mrs. Hale understood first. "A false book." "Not entirely false," Margaret said. "It must be valuable enough for her to steal, and distinctive enough for us to identify wherever she takes it." They prepared a copy containing one abandoned formula and marked every page with a harmless violet compound known only to Margaret and Dr. Bell. The next morning, word was allowed to spread that a porter had recovered it from beneath the dispensary floor. By nightfall, someone entered the room where the book had been placed under watch. The thief did not know that Magistrate Vale's men were already following him toward the river. Magistrate Vale's men followed the thief without attempting an arrest. He crossed the district on horseback, changed carriages at a roadside inn, and reached the Thames shortly before dawn. The brass token recovered from Miss Carter opened the gate to Ashford's private quay. The stolen formula book was carried inside. By sunrise, Vale had obtained a search order based on the warehouse token, Miss Carter's testimony, and the theft witnessed during the night. Margaret accompanied the officers with Dr. Bell and 2 independent chemists. Edmund asked to join them. "No," Margaret said. "Your presence would allow Ashford to claim this is a private quarrel between political rivals." For once, Edmund accepted the refusal. The warehouse appeared to contain ordinary medical supplies. Crates of glass bottles stood beside barrels of alcohol, dried herbs, and sealing wax. The clerk in charge insisted that Ashford merely financed a legitimate dispensary. Margaret examined one crate. Every bottle carried her name. "Where did you obtain permission to use this seal?" she asked. The clerk gave no answer. Mrs. Hale discovered a concealed staircase behind a row of empty shelves. Beneath the warehouse, 12 workers were mixing and bottling tinctures from handwritten instructions. Dr. Pritchard stood at the central table. When he saw the officers, he dropped a ledger into a stove. Vale's constables pulled it out before the pages were completely destroyed. Lord Ashford attempted to leave through a river door, but 2 officers were already guarding the quay. "You have no proof these medicines are unlawful," he said as they stopped him. "The formulas belong to Bell Street, and Bell Street belongs to me." "The building was transferred to you," Margaret replied. "Not the trust, its name, or my work." Ashford pointed to the stolen book lying open on the table. "That volume proves the formulas came from your own records." Margaret asked Dr. Bell for the prepared testing solution. He brushed it across the corner of a page. Violet marks appeared between the lines. This book was placed under official observation yesterday, Vale said. Your man stole it and delivered it here. Its presence does not prove ownership. It proves receipt of stolen evidence. Ashford's confidence faltered. The search uncovered molds for Margaret's counterfeit seal, stacks of false labels, and delivery lists matching the villages where patients had been poisoned. One cabinet contained blank death certificates. Another held altered copies of the relief debts. The independent chemists took sealed samples from every batch. Their preliminary examination found the same suspicious metallic residue detected in Pritchard's tonic. Pritchard began blaming Ashford before the search was complete. He ordered the quantities, the physician protested. I only adjusted the formula. You gave the medicine to my son, Margaret said. Lord Ashford told me the boy's illness would make your guilt believable. Ashford turned on him. You fool. That outburst was recorded by Vale's clerk. Both men were arrested for fraud, theft, conspiracy, and suspected poisoning. The evidence of arson would require further testimony, but the warehouse was sealed and every bottle placed under official custody. Lady Lavinia was not found. Her private office had been emptied before the officers arrived. The fireplace still held warm ashes, and the carriage assigned to her had disappeared during the night. Mrs. Hale searched the desk drawers and found a narrow accounting book trapped behind one of them. Most pages contained payments to clerks, printers, and warehouse workers. The final entries recorded money sent to Pritchard and the men who attacked the temporary infirmary. One payment was different. It had been made 3 months earlier, before the hospital transfer, before the counterfeit medicine, and before Ashford publicly approached Edmund about Parliament. The recipient was listed only by initials. Heir Margaret recognized the amount. It matched a private deposit made into Edmund's campaign account. Ashford's conspiracy had begun earlier than her husband had admitted, and somewhere among the letters Edmund surrendered, one piece of the truth was still missing. The initials ER did not prove that Edmund knew of the poison. They proved he had received money from Ashford 3 months before the banquet, earlier than he had admitted. When Margaret confronted him, Edmund did not deny the payment. It was the first campaign advance, he said. Ashford asked me to keep it private until he secured the necessary votes. You told me your agreement began with the hospital transfer. The final agreement did. That is not what I asked. Edmund looked toward Henry, who slept in the adjoining room under Dr. Bell's supervision. There was an earlier memorandum, he admitted. Where is it? Ashford retained the original. I destroyed my copy. Margaret stared at him. That is why it was missing from the correspondence you surrendered. Yes. The memorandum had given Ashford preliminary authority to examine Bell Street's finances, review its staffing, and prepare the relief debts for collection. Edmund had signed it weeks before informing Margaret or the trustees. He still insisted he knew nothing of the counterfeit medicine. Margaret believed that much. A single rose the vitals. Ashford would never have entrusted the poisoning plan to a man as impulsive as Edmund. But Edmund had knowingly opened the doors. Before Margaret could demand the full terms, a solicitor representing Lady Lavinia arrived at Sir Thomas's house. He carried a sealed proposal and a copy of the missing memorandum. It was worse than Edmund had described. He had authorized Ashford to close Bell Street's free ward, dismiss any nurse considered financially unnecessary, and pursue the sale of land pledged against overdue relief loans. In return, Ashford promised campaign funds and parliamentary support. Beneath the final clause, Edmund had written, "Proceed as necessary, provided the votes are secured before the autumn session." Margaret felt no shock, only confirmation. Lavinia's proposal was simple. If Margaret withdrew her accusation connecting Lavinia to the warehouse and the infirmary fire, the original memorandum would remain private. If Margaret refused, it would be released to every newspaper in London. "She believes you will protect me," Edmund said. "She still mistakes me for your possession." The solicitor waited for Margaret's answer. "Tell Lady Lavinia to publish it." Edmund turned toward her, but she did not soften the decision. "The public deserves to know what you authorized." "I agree," he said. Margaret studied him carefully. The admission cost him more than his earlier apologies. Once the memorandum became public, no political sponsor could claim Edmund had merely been deceived by Ashford. It would also expose him to civil claims from the hospital trust and the threatened landowners. You understand that this may cost you your career and much of your personal property. It should. Margaret gave the solicitor a written refusal and retained a witness copy of the memorandum. Magistrate Vale used Lavinia's attempted bargain as further evidence that she had controlled the financial operation. The solicitor was not arrested, but he was compelled to reveal where he had received his instructions. Lavinia was found that night in a rented house near the railway offices. Officers recovered newspaper drafts blaming Margaret for the poison, payments to the men who set the fire, and correspondence ordering Pritchard to use Henry's illness to discredit Bell Street. She was taken into custody without resistance. The following morning, the Crown ordered a public hearing to determine the hospital's ownership, the validity of the village debts, and the responsibility of everyone involved. Ashford, Lavinia, Pritchard, Margaret, and Edmund would testify before the same audience. Outside the chamber, Edmund approached his wife. "I will tell them everything," he said. "I will not ask you to defend me." "No," Margaret replied. "You will defend the truth for once." The doors opened. Inside waited the nurses Edmund had sacrificed, the villagers Ashford had marked for ruin, and the reporters who had once printed Margaret's guilt before any patient had been examined. Then the clerk called her name. Margaret entered the hearing chamber, carrying Bell Street's first patient register. A judge chaired the inquiry with Magistrate Vale and 2 independent medical representatives. Before them sat the hospital trustees, injured villagers, railway officials, nurses, and reporters. Margaret began with what Edmund had actually possessed. The Ravenscourt estate owned the Bell Street building, she said. It did not own the beds, medicines, charitable funds, formulas, or the hospital's name. Those belonged to the trust. She opened the register. Its first page recorded the money used to establish Bell Street, Margaret's dowry trust, Sir Thomas's foundation, and donations collected by its nurses. Edmund had transferred a building. Ashford and Lavinia had forged the authority to take everything inside it. Dr. Bell presented the authentic tincture beside the counterfeit medicine given to Henry and the villagers. Independent chemists confirmed that Pritchard's bottles contained a harmful metallic compound absent from Margaret's preparation. Mrs. Hale identified the false delivery ledger. Miss Carter described the men who broke into the temporary infirmary before it burned. Magistrate Vale produced the counterfeit seal, the stolen formula book, and the records recovered from Ashford's warehouse. The railway maps completed the chain. Every household named on the premature death certificates owned land along the proposed railway corridor. Ashford's altered debts would have allowed his investors to acquire those properties before the route became public. Pritchard claimed he had merely followed instructions. Ashford blamed his sister. Lavinia insisted the warehouse had operated without her knowledge. Her own letters contradicted them all. Then Edmund took the witness chair. "I authorized Lord Ashford to examine Bell Street's accounts and collect the relief debts," he said. "I knew he intended to close the free ward, dismiss nurses, and pursue borrowers who could not pay." The chamber fell silent. "I did not know of the poisoning, the forged death certificates, or the arson. But I accepted suffering I could foresee because Ashford promised me money and political advancement." Duchess Margaret objected. "I dismissed her warnings because they obstructed what I wanted." His admission did not absolve him. It established exactly where his guilt began. The judge voided Ashford's claim to Bell Street's trust property and prohibited the use of Margaret's name or formulas. The altered debts were suspended for a full audit, while the genuine loans would be renegotiated directly with each landowner. The railway company withdrew from every transaction connected to Ashford. Ashford, Lavinia, and Pritchard were committed for criminal trial on charges including fraud, theft, conspiracy, arson, and administering poisoned medicine. Their final sentences would be decided separately after trial. Edmund faced no charge of poisoning, but innocence of that crime did not protect him from the consequences of his own agreement. His parliamentary sponsors abandoned him. The hospital trustees brought a civil claim for losses caused by the unlawful transfer. To settle it and repay the legitimate campaign debt, Edmund agreed to sell his London residence, hunting lodge, horses, and most of his personal collection. He also granted Bell Street a permanent lease at a nominal rent and transferred its adjoining garden to the charitable trust. Neither he nor any future Duke of Ravenscourt would control its staff, patients, accounts, or medicines. Months later, the hospital reopened. The nurses returned first. Then came the patients Ashford had intended to exclude. A plaque beneath the restored Bell named the physicians, workers, trustees, and villagers who had preserved Bell Street after its doors were taken from them. Henry recovered gradually. Edmund was allowed to visit him by arrangement, but every medical decision belonged to Margaret and Dr. Bell. Edmund accepted those conditions without demanding gratitude. Margaret secured a formal deed of separation, an independent income, and the right to establish Henry's principal residence with her. She did not seek reconciliation. On the morning Bell Street reopened, Edmund came to the courtyard carrying the brass key Margaret had placed beside her glass at the banquet. "I thought you should have this," he said. Margaret took it. For a moment, hope appeared in his face. "It does not open the old lock," he explained. "The trustees replaced it." "I know. Then why keep it?" Margaret looked toward the entrance, where Mrs. Hale was welcoming the first patients. "Because it reminds me of the last thing you believed you could take from me." Edmund lowered his eyes. He had confessed, surrendered property, and repaired part of the damage. Those acts mattered. They did not restore the trust he had knowingly destroyed. Margaret walked past him and entered the hospital. Above the courtyard, the bell began to ring. A year earlier, Edmund had stood before 300 guests and announced that Bell Street no longer belonged to his wife. Now the hospital belonged to no duke at all, and Margaret alone held the new key.